Triumphant. The Allies defeat the Nazis, and Stalin expands his empire. In November 1943, Stalin met with U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in the Iranian capital of Tehran to discuss the progress of the war. The fighting was far from over, but the Allies had the Germans on the defensive. The Red Army was driving Hitler's troops out of the Soviet Union. The Americans controlled the Atlantic Ocean. A combined American and British force had landed in Italy and was battling its way north. Since 1941, Stalin had been impatiently urging Churchill and Roosevelt to launch an invasion of France. A major assault there would force Hitler to fight on a second front. He would have to pull troops out of the Soviet Union to defend the German homeland. Stalin got his wish, but not right away. On June 6, 1944, a date that became known as D-Day, a vast fleet of troop transports crossed the English Channel. More than 160,000 Allied soldiers landed on the French coast and began fighting their way inland. Stalin was not impressed. By now, he firmly believed that the Soviets would defeat the Nazis with or without a second front. Stalin was convinced that the Americans and the British had delayed the invasion in order to weaken the Soviet army. Whether his accusation was justified or not, Stalin was right about one thing: the Allies had become rivals. And the war to defeat Germany had become a race for territory. The Soviets were now charging through Eastern Europe and closing in on Germany from the east. The British, Canadians, and Americans had retaken France and were pressing in from the west. Whoever occupied a country when the Germans surrendered would have tremendous influence there after the war. The Allied leaders met again in February 1945 in the Ukrainian city of Yalta. Stalin now insisted on a Soviet sphere of influence in territories occupied by the Red Army. His aim was to install governments obedient to the Soviet Union in Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania. Churchill and Roosevelt reluctantly agreed. There was little they could do to oppose Stalin in countries controlled by the Red Army. To free Eastern Europe from Soviet control would have required yet another war. They didn't have the stomach for more combat after 6 years of the most destructive conflict in human history. The Red Army captured Berlin in the early days of May 1945. Soviet troops found Hitler's charred corpse outside the bunker where he had spent the final days of the war. The Soviet people joyously celebrated Hitler's death and their victory. Their country had suffered more casualties than any other during the war. The German invasion had left 26 million Soviets dead and 26 million homeless, and millions more wounded. There was reason to hope that the people would be rewarded for their sacrifice. Stalin had given them more freedom during the war years. And hadn't his people risen to the challenge and saved the country? The people of Leningrad, for instance, had suffered through a 900-day siege in which 1 million civilians lost their lives. In a sense, the Soviet people had rescued the dictator himself. Stalin gave a patronizing thanks to everyone who had sacrificed for the war effort. "I offer a toast to those simple, ordinary, modest people," he said, "to the little cogs who kept our great state mechanism in an active condition in all fields of science, economy, and military affairs." But there would be no gentler future for Stalin's little cogs. The NKVD thugs were still doing their black work, and now they had all of Eastern Europe to police. On May 1st, 1945, Red Army soldiers raised the Soviet flag on top of the German Parliament building in Berlin. A week later, the war in Europe was over.